Shanks' most important battle in the final war, his greatest victory, will be against his twin brother Shamrock, and Oda has set this battle up to be one of the most important moments of One Piece's climax. Not just because this is the one battle that will allow Shanks to truly go all out in the story for the first time, and will be the final domino that brings down the Gods Knights, but because this is set to be one of the most philosophically and thematically important matchups in all of One Piece, that answers maybe the most important moral question in the story, one that Oda has been avoiding addressing this entire time. To understand what I mean, we need to first break down why it's clear that Shanks versus Shamrock will be happening in the final war as Shanks' most important matchup, why this fight is so crucial for unraveling Shanks' character, and finally we need to understand the fundamental moral issue that Oda has been building up to with the Celestial Dragons this entire time, that Oda crafted the Shanks and Shamrock storyline from the beginning to answer. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. But first, if you want to get One Piece's beautiful islands for your walls, you can get any 2 island posters and get another 2 free and free shipping on our brand new site, OneDreamStudio.com. And we know how much you all enjoyed the island posters, but we've got something even bigger for you around the corner. What we've got next for you all is something you're not going to find anywhere else. Stay tuned. So that aside, to begin with, Shanks is likely the most important side character in all of One Piece, outside the Straw Hats. He was the character that Oda began the story with alongside Luffy. Oda has made it clear that the final saga will be very Shanks-centric, to the point that readers will know they're in the finale of One Piece when Shanks becomes extremely prominent, and Oda has stated that he basically views Shanks as his own self-insert character. So considering Shanks was written from the start to be such an important figure, and Oda obviously had his plans for Shanks in the final saga laid out from the beginning, that means that Oda was also likely planning Shanks' opponents in the final saga from the beginning. And by that, I mean there are 2 major fights that Shanks should get by the end of One Piece. The first one that we know is also likely Shanks' final fight, Shanks vs. Blackbeard. Shanks and Blackbeard's showdown has been built up for a long time now, with their extensive rivalry beginning with Blackbeard scarring Shanks, and Shanks having marked Blackbeard as an evil threat that must be monitored ever since. Oda has practically outright spelled out for us that a showdown between Shanks and Blackbeard is inevitable. However, we know that this fight is naturally going to have to be a loss for Shanks. Blackbeard is ultimately Luffy's enemy to defeat, and as such, the dynamic between Shanks, Blackbeard, and Luffy seems to be set for the typical fictional trope where the mentor figure, Shanks, is defeated by the antagonist, Blackbeard, to make for a symbolic passing of the torch when the young protagonist, Luffy, defeats Blackbeard in Shanks' stead, likely surpassing his mentor in the process. But at the same time, if Shanks vs. Blackbeard was likely planned from the get-go to be a loss for Shanks, then considering how much Oda loves Shanks as a character, considering how narratively significant Shanks is, and considering that Oda has teased for so long, both in story and in interviews, the prospect of getting to see Shanks fight, that would suggest that the first time Oda has Shanks actually have a serious fight in the story wouldn't be just to have Shanks lose to Blackbeard. It would be incredibly disappointing after all the teasing of brief glimpses of Shanks' strength throughout the story if for the first time that he finally actually goes all out, that he just falls flat on his face, and this also just wouldn't line up with Oda's love for the character at all. As such, it's very likely that Shanks will have another major fight before Blackbeard, one where Shanks gets to actually display his full strength and actually gets to win. This does the character justice before he is inevitably defeated. And so now we look at the roster of villains that could actually make sense for Shanks' big victory, and we can narrow it down pretty fast. The remaining clear antagonists in the story that need to be defeated besides the Blackbeard Pirates are all currently on the world government side. And so here we have the Marines, the Gods Knights, the Gorosei, and Imu. We can take Imu off the board since nothing in the story suggests that Shanks' role is to defeat God himself. And I believe we can take all the Admirals off the board. At this point in time, there's no point in seeing Shanks fight an Admiral, as Oda already gave us the Green Bull scene where Shanks made an Admiral immediately surrender just from his basic Conqueror's Haki release alone. I've seen some people argue that it was the red-haired pirates as a whole that scared Green Bull, but that's not true. Green Bull was immediately terrified and quaking in his boots the moment he felt Shanks and Shanks' Haki alone, and this was before Green Bull even realized whose Haki it was. This scene basically makes the prospect of Shanks fighting an Admiral completely uninteresting, as Oda already established that there is a significant gap there. If Shanks can scare an Admiral away without even a single attack, then that doesn't make for an exciting matchup between Shanks versus an Admiral down the line. And while you could argue that Green Bull might just be the weakest Admiral, The admirals are all still generally portrayed as relative to one another. It's never suggested that there are massive gaps between the admirals, and a fitting opponent for Shanks would need to be a lot stronger than Green Bull to be exciting. The only Marine that might have an argument is Akainu, but there's a long list of characters who have far more narrative likelihood of being the one to defeat Akainu than Shanks. That leaves the Celestial Dragons, and this makes a lot more sense as narratively Shanks' story is deeply tied to the Celestial Dragons. Shanks is essentially the lost Celestial Dragon, the one who fell from heaven and instead grew up on the seas, going on to carry the will of the Celestial Dragons' enemies, the D-Tribe. The more that we understand Shanks' story, the more that we realize that Shanks has been quietly carrying out Roger's will to bring the fall of the Celestial Dragons, with Shanks first finding the legendary Nika fruit, then recognizing the destined successor who can grow up to bring the dawn, and in recent years making sure that the path is paved for this successor to reach his full potential. As such, Shanks himself will not be a bystander in the inevitable battle against the Celestial Dragons. Shanks' own story has been building towards him helping see Roger's plans come to fruition, and fighting alongside the world against the Celestial Dragons. And so looking at the Gorosei and the Gods Knights as Shanks' potential enemies, we can easily scrap most of the Gods Knights as being too weak. From what we've seen, the Gods Knights are certainly powerful, but they are not top tiers. But the one exception would likely of course be Shamrock. Based on the fact that Garling was just promoted from Supreme Commander of the Gods Knights to the Gorosei, Shamrock is also likely due for a promotion now to take that vacant position of Supreme Commander of the Gods Knights for himself. Just from positioning, it's likely Oda is setting up Shamrock to be the next leader of the Gods Knights, and also based on Oda's big establishing speech of all the major players in One Piece, it seems pretty clear that Shamrock is going to be the leader of the Gods Knights, as he is the only Gods Knight in the spread. So just looking at the 5 Gorosei and Shamrock, the leader of the Gods Knights, we have 6 options for Shanks' final war opponent. But really, it should obviously be either between Garling or Shamrock. After Joy Boy's Haki Knot defeated all 4 of the other Gorosei at the same time, and it was established that Shanks' Conqueror's Haki is actually comparable to Joy Boy's, it doesn't seem like there'd be any point to seeing Shanks against any of these 4. Even if you feel like maybe Warcury or Venus Juro could somehow put up a good fight against Shanks, the other issue is that there is just no narrative significance for Shanks versus either of these characters, whereas there are 2 Celestial Dragons who are clearly established to be far more significant players in the story, Garling and Shamrock, and who both also have clear narrative ties to Shanks. Garling is Shanks' evil father who actually killed Shanks' mother, and Shamrock is of course Shanks' dark twin counterpart. Looking at these 2 options, I do feel like there is a solid argument for Garling. It really is remarkable looking at young Garling and seeing a vision of a heartless and cruel Shanks. While Garling is defined by his heartlessness, Shanks has always reflected kindness, empathy, and human emotion. The contrast between seeing father and son fight each other could be powerful. However, at the same time, Garling may already be set to be Dragon's opponent in the final war. Readers have noticed that in the present day, chapters with Garling appearing often feature a parallel appearance from Dragon. This may be a coincidence, but at the same time we can already assume that since overthrowing the Celestial Dragons is primarily Dragon's wheelhouse in the story, that Dragon will be getting an extremely important opponent to defeat among the Celestial Dragons, and the strongest Gorosei would be fitting. It would be a bit weird if a character as important as Dragon did not end up defeating one of the villains from this spread, so Garling does seem like the best option for him. And even if that seems too speculative, the God Valley flashback now makes it all the more likely that Dragon will face Garling in the final war. Since in God Valley we have a young dragon who has been tasked with his first ever mission of rebellion, and it is against Garling. Dragon's mission is to protect the infants, Shanks and Shamrock, from falling into the hands of their evil father. And Dragon is doing so on behalf of the woman that Garling mercilessly killed. Considering Dragon's very first act of revolution is against Garling, and his very first enemy among the Celestial Dragons is Garling, that does suggest that these 2 are perhaps fated to be enemies again in the future, when Dragon has grown up and has become strong enough to actually fight Garling himself directly, rather than simply hoping to escape from him as he had to at God Valley. It's also worth noting that Dragon only half succeeds at God Valley in his efforts to save the babies from Garling. He's able to get Shanks away from Garling, but not Shamrock. I do believe that at this point, Dragon vs. Garling seems like it would bring Dragon's story full circle, and getting to see Dragon actually fight Garling in a way that Dragon couldn't as a young Marine rookie does seem like the perfect final war matchup for him. So this really just leaves Shamrock as Shanks' final opponent, and what a fitting opponent this makes. Throughout the story, Oda spent so much time hyping up Shanks to ridiculous levels without giving him an actual fight, such that at this point the easiest way to finally give Shanks an actually worthy opponent is to have Shanks fight himself. Shanks versus Evil Shanks. In God Valley, Shanks and Shamrock are being presented as this fated duo, twin brothers identical at birth and separated at birth by fate. This divergence leads them down two very different paths. While they both seemed pure and innocent as infants, based on the environment that each of them was raised in, they grew into completely different people, each of them representing the exact opposite ideals. While Shanks, raised by supposedly evil pirates, grew up to be the absolute paragon of virtue in One Piece, a moral sage with a kind heart, Shamrock, raised by the supposed gods of the world, grew up to be a cold-hearted monster. As such, Shanks vs. Shamrock is a fight that seems set up with tremendous potential to both delve deeply into Shanks' character as well as to hammer in some absolutely crucial thematic messaging for the finale of the entire story. To begin with, character-wise, Shanks, while a very important figure in the story, has always been someone who we've seen from a bit of a distance. Shanks has always been portrayed as this wise, philosophical figure who always seems to know the right thing to say or do in every scenario. Someone who is walking a path with a deep sense of certainty behind him. However, in actuality, Shanks isn't just some perfect idealized figure. There is a real person behind what we see on the surface. Someone who clearly has his own conflicts and realities that he had to come to terms with over life. And the single glaring pain point for a man like Shanks would likely have been that he is actually a celestial dragon. That despite growing up among the Roger Pirates, despite being so down to earth and treating others with kindness, his blood is that of the most heinous and evil devils of the world. For a time, Shanks was even marked with this symbol of the evil that he came from, and we know that Shanks even went back to Marijoa at some point to confront his past. So while Shanks has always played the role of this enigmatic but calming figure that seems to exist to solve the conflicts of others, once we are in the final saga and it's time to get to Shanks' own core character conflict, the clear setup for him has been grappling with the fact that he himself is a celestial dragon, meaning that Shanks' most important battle should go directly to addressing that core conflict in some way. That makes a battle against Shanks' own Dark Mirror, facing his lineage head-on, carry tremendous writing potential. Shanks vs. Shamrock will be the battle where we finally come to understand Shanks, and defeating Shamrock will likely allow Shanks to put his origins to rest. But on a larger level, why is this battle so important to the narrative of One Piece itself? Well, the final saga, as the conclusion of the entire narrative, is going to have to tackle a lot of One Piece's most important themes and put a bow on them. And one of the absolute most important recurring ideas in the story has always been nature versus nurture, and the origin of evil. For those who grew up evil, how much of it is their own innate nature, whereas how much of it is due to the circumstances that they were forced to grow up in? When it comes to pirates, there are a lot of gray areas, as many of their actions may be inexcusable, but we can still understand what drove them to become who they are. But when it comes to the Celestial Dragons, morality becomes particularly difficult to examine since the Celestial Dragons really are the absolute worst of the worst. But at the same time, Oda still makes clear that a lot of this is due to their environmental conditioning. Celestial Dragons can change, we've seen that before, but at the same time, what exactly does Oda want to say about the Celestial Dragons at the end of the story? We've got a little preview of the Shanks and Shamrock situation with Doflamingo and Corazon. They were both Celestial Dragon children, cast out of heaven, both experienced the same pain and suffering on Earth, but one grew into an absolute monster just like the other Celestial Dragons above, whereas the other grew up to have a kind heart. A large part of this is implied to be because Corazon found a parental figure who actually was able to show him love, and that in turn allowed Corazon to grow up knowing love, while on the other hand, Doflamingo was found by Treble, Pika, Virgo, and Diamante, who guided Doflamingo towards hate. But to be fair, Doflamingo was already extremely evil well before they found him. In fact, he was extremely evil well before the commoners started torturing him, and Doflamingo actually shot his own father who previously did show Doflamingo love. At the same time, you could argue that, well, Corazon was younger, so maybe Corazon hadn't fully internalized the Celestial Dragon mentality before they were cast out of Marijoa, whereas Doflamingo had. And so the discussion about nature versus nurture around these two can go in circles. But with Shanks and Shamrock, it's very different in that these two characters are identical twins separated at birth, meaning an exact age match, a near genetic match, and the only difference between the two is their upbringing. One grew up good, yet the other grew up evil. So does that mean that if their situations were swapped, couldn't Shanks have been the evil one and Shamrock be the hero? Through that lens, what is Oda going to say through the battle between Shanks and Shamrock? The thematic implications from the messaging of this battle will likely extend to how we, the reader, are supposed to view the Celestial Dragons as a whole. In fact, this battle is likely going to be the single most important battle in One Piece when it comes to establishing Oda's ideas on good and evil. As terrible as the Celestial Dragons are, what is the messaging going to be when it comes to how much of their evil is their fault, versus how much of that is fate that is out of their control? And more importantly, what is Oda going to say that means for what they should deserve at the end of the story? Let me know how you feel about it in the comments below, but as you can see, Shanks vs Shamrock is set to be philosophically likely the most important concluding battle in all of One Piece. One that sets in stone how we are supposed to view not just pirates, not just marines, but the ultimate villains of the story, the Celestial Dragons themselves. If you enjoyed this video, then definitely like and subscribe. And if you want to hear my analysis of what I believe Oda's moral messaging around the Celestial Dragons will be, you can listen to my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Link in the description below.